"Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now." The words cut through the night like a switchblade, sharp and controlled, hanging in the cold air just as the baby in the back seat began to cry. Danielle Carter didn't move right away. Her hands stayed steady on the steering wheel, fingers resting at 10 and 2, just like she'd been taught years ago. Outside, red and blue lights pulsed across the dark stretch of highway, reflecting in fractured patterns across her windshield, her side mirror, her eyes. The world beyond the glass looked distorted, unreal, like something already decided before she even had a chance to speak. In the back seat, Noah's soft cries turned into a shaky wail, the kind that came from confusion more than fear. Danielle exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm she forced into control. "It's okay, baby," she said quietly, her voice low and even, barely louder than the hum of the engine. "Mama's right here." A second knock hit the window, firmer this time. Danielle turned her head. The officer standing beside her door, tall, broad-shouldered, hand resting near his belt, tilted his chin slightly, signaling impatience without raising his voice. Behind him, another patrol car idled at an angle, headlights cutting across the asphalt. Two more officers stood nearby, their silhouettes shifting under the flashing lights. 3 of them. For a routine stop. Danielle reached up slowly, pressing the button to lower her window. Cold air slipped inside immediately, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and distant exhaust. "Evening, officer," she said, her tone calm, measured. The officer didn't return the greeting. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, lingering just a fraction too long on the back seat, on the diaper bag, on the child. "License and registration." Danielle nodded once. No sudden movements. She reached for her purse, unzipping it carefully, aware of every second stretching longer than it should. Behind her, Noah whimpered again, his small hands rustling against the blanket. Danielle glanced back briefly, her gaze softening for just a moment before returning forward. "You were swerving," the officer added, his voice flat, rehearsed. Danielle paused, her fingers brushing against her wallet. "I wasn't," she said, not defensive, just certain. The officer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't respond to her words, only extended his hand slightly further into the window, waiting. Danielle handed over her license. His eyes dropped to it, scanning quickly, then again, slower this time. Something unreadable passed across his face, gone as quickly as it came. He stepped back, motioning toward the rear of the vehicle. "Step out of the car." Noah cried louder now, the sound sharper, filling the silence between them. Danielle didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just reached back, adjusting the edge of the baby's blanket with one gentle motion before opening the door. The night air wrapped around her as she stepped out, the flashing lights painting her skin in alternating colors, red, blue, like a warning she hadn't been given the chance to understand yet. She closed the door softly behind her, leaving the engine running, leaving the warmth inside with her child. And as she turned to face the officers, her expression didn't show fear. Between Danielle and the vehicle, as if trying to place something that did not quite sit right. The third remained near the patrol car, one hand resting lightly on the hood, watching without speaking. "Do you know why you were stopped?" Blake asked. Danielle met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "You said I was swerving," she replied calmly. "I was not." The words did not carry defiance, only clarity. Blake's expression did not change, but his jaw set tighter, a small shift that spoke louder than any raised voice. He circled slightly, positioning himself so that the lights hit her face more directly, forcing her into the brightest part of the scene while he remained half-shadowed. "We received a call," he continued. "Vehicle matching this description, erratic driving." Danielle tilted her head just slightly, enough to show she was listening, not enough to appear submissive. "And did they mention a baby in the back seat?" she asked, her voice still level, still controlled. Blake did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the rear window, where the outline of the car seat was visible under the intermittent flashes of light. Noah let out another small cry, softer now, more tired than afraid. The younger officer shifted his weight, taking a small step closer to the vehicle, peering through the glass. His brows furrowed for a moment, as if the image did not match whatever expectation had been placed in his mind before they arrived. It should be. A diaper bag resting on the seat, a folded blanket, a small stuffed animal tucked beside Noah's leg. The officer paused, his hand hovering over the bag for a brief second before unzipping it. The sound of the zipper was louder than it should have been. He looked inside, shifting a few items gently: bottles, wipes, a change of clothes. Nothing unusual, nothing hidden. Noah stirred slightly at the movement, his small hand curling instinctively toward the nearest warmth, brushing against the edge of the bag. The officer froze for a second, then slowly withdrew his hand, zipping the bag closed with more care than he had opened it. Back outside, Blake watched, his expression unreadable. Danielle stood still, her arms relaxed, her posture unchanged, but her eyes moved carefully, taking in every detail, every hesitation, every glance exchanged between them. "Anything?" Blake called out. The younger officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second too long. "No, sir," he replied finally, his voice quieter now. Blake turned back to Danielle, studying her again, as if trying to reconcile something that no longer aligned with his initial assumption. The silence stretched, thicker this time, less certain. Danielle spoke first, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Not challenging, not impatient, just precise. Blake did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his radio, his thumb hovering over the button as his eyes flicked once more to her face, then to the car, then back again. Something had shifted, small but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had seemed solid just moments before. The radio crackled softly in Officer Blake's hand, the static cutting through the silence like a low hum beneath everything else. And for a moment he did not press the button. He just stood there, eyes still on Danielle, as if waiting for something to shift back into place, something that made more sense than what he was seeing now. A woman standing calmly under flashing lights, a crying child behind her, and nothing that justified the weight of the stop they had created. Danielle did not move, but her breathing slowed, steady and deliberate, her gaze fixed not on his badge, not on the patrol car, but on his eyes, holding contact in a way that was not confrontational, just present, as if she was giving him the space to decide what came next. Behind her, Noah's cries softened into quiet whimpers, the kind that faded into small breaths, and Danielle turned her head slightly, just enough to listen without breaking her stance, her voice low again. "It is okay. Baby, I am right here." The words barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than the sirens that no longer felt urgent. The younger officer stepped back from the open passenger door, closing it gently, more carefully than before, and as the latch clicked into place, he glanced toward Blake again, this time not for instruction, but for confirmation, as if something unspoken had already begun to unravel between them. Blake finally pressed the radio button, his thumb firm, his voice controlled. "Dispatch, confirm vehicle plate," he said, reading the numbers slowly, each digit measured, leaving no room for error, and as he spoke, Danielle's eyes flicked briefly toward his hand, then back to his face, her expression unchanged, but something behind it sharpened, like a thought forming that she chose not to voice yet. The radio responded with a burst of static, then a calm voice repeating the plate back, asking for a moment to verify, and that moment stretched, filling the space between all of them with something heavier than before, something closer to doubt. Blake lowered the radio slightly but did not let it fall to his side, his posture still firm, still holding onto the version of control he had walked into this stop with, even as it began to slip in small, almost invisible ways. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked, his tone softer now, not by intention, but by something he could not fully control. Danielle answered without hesitation. "From work," she said, and when he did not follow up immediately, she added, "Downtown. Late shift." Blake nodded once, but the question that usually followed did not come, as if he was no longer sure what he was trying to prove. Instead, his eyes drifted again to the car, to the quiet outline of the child inside, then back to Danielle, and this time there was a flicker, small but present, something closer to uncertainty than authority. Danielle noticed it, not reacting outwardly, but storing it, the way she had learned to notice shifts in tone, in posture, in silence, long before this moment. "Officer," she said gently, her voice still even, "you already looked inside," and she paused, not pressing, just letting the statement sit between them, letting him hear it without resistance. The radio came alive again, sharper this time. "Plate confirmed," the dispatcher said, followed by a brief pause that felt longer than it was. "Vehicle registered to Danielle Carter." And then another pause, as if the next line required an extra check. "No flags. No warrants. All clear." The words settled into the night like a weight being placed where tension had been, but they did not release it. Not yet. Blake's grip on the radio tightened just slightly, his jaw setting again, but differently this time, not with suspicion, but with something harder to define. The younger officer exhaled quietly, almost inaudible, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, and he glanced once more at Danielle, this time not as a subject, but as a person standing in front of him. Danielle remained still, her posture unchanged, but her eyes softened just enough to acknowledge the shift, not as relief, but as recognition. "Anything else?" she asked again, her tone the same as before, calm, precise, patient. Blake did not answer right away, his gaze lingering on her face as if trying to reconcile the report he had received with the situation he had created, and for the first time since the lights had come on behind her, he hesitated, not because he had to, but because he did not know what authority looked like anymore in this moment, and the silence that followed was no longer about control, it was about realization, slow and incomplete, but undeniable. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like something heavy being moved just out of sight, and Officer Blake lowered the radio slowly, his hand no longer as firm as before, his fingers adjusting their grip as if the object itself had changed weight. The flashing lights continued behind him, but now they felt less like authority and more like exposure, illuminating details that had gone unnoticed only minutes earlier. Danielle stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, but her presence felt different now, no longer framed by suspicion, but by something harder to ignore. Blake cleared his throat slightly, the sound small, almost out of place in the open air. "All right," he said, though the words did not carry the same certainty they had before. "We are just making sure everything checks out." Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, her eyes steady, her voice calm when she responded. "You already did," she said, not as a challenge, but as a fact. The younger officer shifted again, glancing between them, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more aware, as if he was seeing the situation from a different angle now, one that did not match the version he had stepped into. Blake exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting once more toward the vehicle, toward the child inside, then back to Danielle. "You said you were coming from work," he added, as if returning to a script that no longer quite fit. Danielle tilted her head slightly. "Yes," she answered, and after a brief pause, she added, "A place where details matter." The words landed softly, but they stayed there, hanging between them in a way that made Blake's expression tighten again, not with suspicion, but with recognition that he could not fully place yet. The air felt colder now, or maybe just clearer, and Danielle took a small step forward, not enough to close distance, just enough to shift the balance. "Officer," she said, her tone still even, still composed. "What exactly are you looking for?" Blake opened his mouth to answer, but the response did not come immediately, and in that brief hesitation, the authority he had been holding on to slipped just a little further. He glanced down at the license still in his hand, then back at her, then down again, as if seeing it for the first time without the filter of assumption. The name sat there plainly. Danielle Carter. Nothing hidden, nothing unclear. He turned it over once, unnecessarily, then back again, the motion slower now, more deliberate. "Just procedure," he said finally, though the words sounded thinner than before. Danielle nodded again, but this time there was something behind the movement, not agreement, but acknowledgement of what he had not said. Behind her, Noah stirred, letting out a soft, tired sound, and Danielle's attention shifted instantly, her body turning slightly toward the car, her focus drawn back to the one thing that mattered without hesitation. She took a step toward the rear door, pausing only long enough to look back at Blake. "May I check on my son?" she asked. It was the first question she had asked that required permission, and the shift did not go unnoticed. Blake hesitated again, just long enough for the younger officer to glance at him. Then he nodded. "Go ahead." Danielle moved to the back seat, opening the door gently, the interior light flickering on once more, casting a soft glow that felt almost separate from everything happening outside. She leaned in slightly, her hand resting on Noah's chest, steadying him with a touch that was instinctive, practiced, grounded in something that did not need authority to exist. "It is okay," she whispered again, her voice warmer now, closer, and Noah's small fingers curled around her thumb, holding on without understanding anything beyond the comfort she provided. Outside, Blake watched, his posture no longer rigid, his stance shifting as if the scene in front of him had quietly redefined itself. The younger officer looked away briefly, his gaze dropping to the pavement, then back up again, as if unsure where to place his attention. Danielle closed the door softly and turned back toward them, her expression calm, but her eyes clearer now, sharper, as if the moment had reached a point she had been waiting for without rushing it. "You have everything you need," she said, not asking, not insisting, just stating it plainly. Blake held her gaze, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond, because there was nothing left in the situation that justified continuing, nothing except the weight of what had already happened, and the realization of it settling slowly, like light reaching a place it had not touched before. Officer Blake did not move right away, and in that stillness the sound of the highway returned, distant tires passing every few seconds, the low rush of air that had been there all along but drowned out by flashing lights and assumptions. He looked at Danielle, really looked this time, not at her hands, not at her car, but at her face, and something about the way she stood there, calm without being passive, steady without needing to prove anything, made the moment feel different than anything he had expected when he first stepped out of his patrol car. The younger officer shifted again, this time taking a small step back, his posture no longer aligned with Blake's, as if the invisible line of authority between them had loosened without either of them saying it out loud. Blake glanced down once more at the license in his hand, then finally extended it back toward her. "You can take this," he said, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but stripped of the edge it had carried before. Danielle reached out and took it, her fingers brushing the edge of the card with the same controlled motion she had used all along. No sudden movements, no unnecessary gestures. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone even, not warm, not cold, just complete. The words settled between them, and for a moment no one spoke. The flashing lights continued their rhythm, but now they felt out of place, like a signal that had not yet caught up to the reality of the situation. Blake cleared his throat again, shifting his weight slightly. "You are free to go," he said, the phrase familiar, procedural, but it did not land the way it usually did, because there was something behind it now, something unspoken that both of them understood without naming. Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but she did not turn immediately. Instead, she held his gaze for a brief second longer, not to challenge him, not to prolong the moment, but to mark it, to let it exist fully before it passed. "Next time," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that did not need volume, "make sure you are stopping the right person for the right reason." There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity, and that made it harder to ignore. Blake's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not respond, because there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been set in motion. The younger officer looked down briefly, his expression unreadable, then back up again, as if committing the moment to memory in a way he did not yet fully understand. Danielle turned then, walking back to her car with the same measured pace she had used when she stepped out, her movements controlled, deliberate, unaffected by the presence behind her. She opened the driver's door and paused, her hand resting on the frame for just a second before she leaned inside. "We are okay," she whispered to Noah, her voice softening instantly, and the baby responded with a small, tired sound, his breathing already calmer now that her presence was close again. Danielle adjusted his blanket once more, smoothing it over his chest, her touch gentle and practiced. Then she closed the door and slid back into the driver's seat. Inside, the world felt different, quieter, separated from the flashing lights that still pulsed outside the glass. She placed the license back into her purse, her movements unhurried, then rested her hands on the steering wheel again, fingers settling into place as if returning to something familiar. For a moment, she did not start the car. She just sat there, her reflection faintly visible in the rearview mirror, her eyes steady, her breathing even. Outside, Blake stood where she had left him, his posture no longer rigid, his gaze following her movements without the same certainty he had carried before. The younger officer stepped closer to him, lowering his voice. "She did not do anything wrong," he said quietly. Blake did not answer immediately. He watched as Danielle turned the key, the engine humming back to life, a steady sound that cut through the last remnants of tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I know." The words came slower than they should have, as if admitting them required more effort than he expected. The patrol lights continued to flash. For another second, then Blake reached back and switched them off. The sudden absence of color changed the scene entirely, leaving only the dim glow of headlights and the quiet stretch of road ahead. Danielle eased the car forward, pulling back onto the highway with smooth, controlled motion, merging into the flow of traffic as if nothing had happened, as if the last several minutes had not existed at all. But something had changed, not in the road, not in the night, but in the space between what was assumed and what was true. Blake stood there for a moment longer, the darkness settling around him now without the shield of flashing lights. And in that quiet he understood something he had not seen before, not because it was hidden, but because he had not looked closely enough until it was too late to ignore. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines, the kind that made everything feel farther apart than it really was. And Danielle kept both hands steady on the wheel as the car settled into a smooth 60 miles per hour, the hum of the engine low and consistent beneath her. In the rearview mirror, the flashing lights were gone now, replaced by darkness and distance. But the shape of what had just happened still lingered, not as fear, not even as anger, but as something heavier, something that did not disappear just because the moment had ended. Noah shifted softly in his seat, his breathing even now, the small rise and fall of his chest visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Danielle glanced back briefly, her eyes softening for just a second, then forward again, her focus returning to the road, to the lane lines that guided her forward without question, without doubt. She reached for the radio, turning it on just low enough to fill the silence, not with noise, but with something familiar, something that did not demand attention. A voice spoke quietly about traffic updates, about lanes closing miles ahead, about delays that could be avoided if you knew where to look. Danielle let out a slow breath, the kind that came from releasing something she had been holding without realizing it, and adjusted her grip on the wheel slightly, her fingers relaxing, just enough to feel like her own again. Back on the side of the road, Officer Blake remained standing where the car had left him, the absence of flashing lights making everything feel more exposed, more real. The younger officer shifted beside him, glancing down the highway, then back at Blake. "That did not feel right," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of honesty that did not need to be loud to be heard. Blake did not respond immediately. He watched the empty stretch of road for a moment longer, as if expecting something to return, something to explain the gap between what he thought he knew and what had actually happened. "We followed the call," Blake said finally, though the words sounded less like a defense and more like a question he was asking himself. The younger officer nodded slightly, but did not look convinced. "The call said erratic driving," he replied. "That was not what we saw." Blake exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension in his stance easing in a way that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with realization. He looked down at his hands, then back at the road, then finally at his partner. "Sometimes," he said, his voice quieter now, "you think you are doing your job, and then you realize you never stopped to check why." The words hung there, not finished, not fully formed, but enough to shift something between them. The third officer remained near the patrol car, silent, watching, his expression unreadable but no longer distant. The night settled back into place around them, the hum of passing cars returning to its usual rhythm, the world continuing forward without acknowledging what had just shifted in that small stretch of highway. Inside her car, Danielle reached a steady stretch of road, the city lights beginning to appear faintly in the distance, glowing against the horizon like something waiting rather than something chasing. She adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, catching her own reflection for a brief second, her eyes steady, her expression calm, but there was something deeper there now, something that had been reinforced rather than shaken. Her phone buzzed softly in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with a notification she did not immediately check. Instead, she kept her focus forward, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, as if the only thing that mattered now was the road ahead and the quiet presence of her son behind her. A mile passed, then another, the distance growing between her and the stop, but not erasing it. She reached down finally, glancing at the phone just long enough to read the message on the screen, then returned her hand to the wheel without responding, her attention never fully leaving the road. The message could wait. The moment could not. Back on the highway, the patrol car doors closed with a soft, final sound, the officers returning to their positions, their movements slower now, less automatic. Blake sat behind the wheel, his hands resting on it without starting the engine right away, his eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. For a brief moment, he saw the scene again, not as it had happened, but as it had looked from her side, the lights, the questions, the assumptions, and something about that perspective stayed with him longer than he expected. He turned the key finally, the engine starting with a low rumble, and pulled back onto the road. But this time the movement felt different, not just forward, but aware, as if something had shifted inside him that could not be undone by distance alone. The city lights grew brighter as Danielle guided the car off the highway and onto a quieter road lined with low buildings and late-night storefronts, their signs glowing softly against the dark sky, and the steady rhythm of driving gave her space to think without forcing her to. The moment on the roadside did not replay in sharp flashes the way some memories did. It lingered instead in fragments, in tones of voice, in pauses that lasted just a second too long, in the way control had shifted without anyone announcing it. Noah stirred again in the back seat, a soft sound escaping him as the car slowed at a red light, and Danielle glanced back, her eyes softening instantly as she reached one hand behind her seat just enough for her fingers to brush the edge of his blanket. "We are almost home," she said quietly, her voice warm, grounded, and the baby responded with a small movement, settling back into the rhythm of sleep. The light turned green, and she continued forward, the tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt, the city now surrounding her in a way that felt familiar, predictable, steady. Her phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, the screen lighting up in the cup holder with the same notification she had ignored before. At the next stop, she picked it up briefly, her eyes scanning the message quickly before placing it back down, her expression unchanged, but her focus sharper now, as if something in that message had aligned with what she already knew. Back in the patrol car, Blake drove in silence, the dashboard casting a faint glow across his face as the road stretched ahead of him. And for the first time that night, he did not turn on the overhead lights. He did not accelerate past the flow of traffic. He simply drove. The younger officer sat beside him, watching the road, then glancing over occasionally, as if waiting for something to be said that had not yet found its way into words. "You ever think about how fast it happens?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Blake kept his eyes forward. "What?" he replied. "The assumption," the younger officer said. "How quick it is." Blake did not answer right away, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but his grip tightened slightly, just enough to show that the question had landed. "You are trained to read situations," Blake said after a moment. "But sometimes you read what you expect to see." The younger officer nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to his lap, then back up again. "And sometimes you are wrong," he added. Blake exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of the engine. "Yeah," he said, "sometimes you are." The patrol car continued down the road, the city lights reflecting off the windshield, creating patterns that shifted with every passing second. And for Blake, those reflections felt different now, less like signals of control and more like reminders of how easily things could be misread. He slowed slightly at an intersection, letting another car pass before continuing, his movements more deliberate, more aware. Inside her car, Danielle pulled into a quiet residential street, the houses spaced evenly along the road, their porch lights casting soft pools of light onto the sidewalks. And as she turned into her driveway, the engine noise softened, then faded as she shifted into park. For a moment, she sat there, her hands still resting on the steering wheel, her eyes forward, taking in the stillness of a space that belonged to her, a space that did not question her presence, did not demand explanation. She turned the engine off, and the sudden quiet felt complete, uninterrupted, real. In the back seat, Noah stirred again, his small hand moving slightly as if reaching for something he could not name, and Danielle turned, unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out of the car before opening the rear door. The night air was cooler here, calmer, untouched by flashing lights or raised voices, and she leaned in, lifting Noah gently into her arms, his head resting against her shoulder as he settled without waking. She closed the car door softly and walked toward the front of the house, her steps quiet against the driveway, the weight of her child grounding her in a way nothing else could. Behind her, the street remained still, unchanged, but inside her, something had been reinforced, not shaken, something steady, something that did not need validation to exist. And miles away, as Blake continued his patrol, that same night stretched on, but it did not feel the same anymore, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it, and the road ahead, no matter how familiar, carries that awareness with every mile. The front door clicked open with a soft, familiar sound, and Danielle stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around her in a way that felt immediate and grounding, like stepping out of one world and into another that asked nothing from her except presence. She closed the door quietly behind her, careful not to let it echo, and paused for just a second in the entryway, adjusting Noah's weight against her shoulder as his breathing settled into a deeper rhythm. The faint scent of clean linen and something warm lingered in the air, unchanged, untouched by anything that had happened outside. She moved through the living room slowly, her steps measured, the soft creak of the wooden floor barely noticeable beneath her feet, and the low light from a single lamp cast a gentle glow across the space, steady and calm. She did not turn on any additional lights. She did not need them. She knew every inch of this space without looking. In the nursery, she leaned over the crib, lowering Noah carefully onto the mattress, her hand resting on his chest for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the steady rise and fall, making sure the rhythm stayed even. His fingers curled once, then relaxed, and she adjusted the blanket gently, smoothing it over him with a touch that carried no urgency, only care. "You are safe," she whispered, the words quiet, almost more for herself than for him, and then she stepped back, watching for one more second before turning away. The house remained still behind her as she walked into the kitchen, placing her purse on the counter with a soft thud that felt louder than it was. Her phone buzzed again, lighting up against the dark surface, and this time she picked it up, unlocking the screen with a single, practiced motion. The message was brief, direct, written in the tone she knew well. A colleague. A reminder about the morning meeting. A note about a case file that needed her attention. Danielle read it once, then again, her eyes scanning the words not for content, but for alignment, for the way the world she worked in operated, precise, structured, built on details that could not be overlooked. She set the phone down slowly, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before pulling away. Across town, in the patrol car, Blake pulled into a quiet parking lot, the engine idling as he sat there without immediately stepping out. The younger officer looked at him, then out at the empty space ahead, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, just present. "You going to write it up?" he asked after a moment, his voice neutral but curious. Blake did not answer right away. He stared through the windshield, his reflection faintly visible against the dark glass, his expression unreadable even to himself. "There is nothing to write," he said finally. The words simple, but they carried more weight than the sentence suggested. The younger officer nodded slowly, as if he understood, or at least accepted it. "Then what happens?" he asked. Blake exhaled quietly, his hand resting on the steering wheel, fingers tapping once, then stopping. "We move on," he said, but the words did not feel complete, not even to him. Because moving on did not erase what had already been seen. Back in her kitchen, Danielle filled a glass with water, the sound of it running from the faucet steady, uninterrupted, and she took a slow sip, letting the quiet settle around her fully now. The moment on the road did not follow her inside as noise or chaos. It followed as clarity, as something that had revealed itself in a way that could not be unseen. She leaned slightly against the counter, her eyes drifting toward the hallway where the nursery door remained slightly open, a soft line of light stretching across the floor. For a second, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not as something overwhelming, but as something real, something that required acknowledgement even in silence. Then she straightened, placing the glass down with a soft sound, and walked toward the hallway, her steps steady, her posture unchanged. In the patrol car, Blake finally turned the engine off, the sudden quiet settling in around him, and he sat there for a moment longer, his hands resting loosely now, no longer gripping, no longer holding on. The younger officer opened the door and stepped out, leaving Blake alone in the dim light of the dashboard. And for the first time that night, there was no movement, no radio, no instruction, just stillness. Blake leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for a brief second, not out of exhaustion, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something shifts internally in a way that cannot be reversed. He opened his eyes again, looking forward, and the reflection staring back at him felt different, not unfamiliar, but no longer unchanged. And in another part of the city, Danielle turned off the last light. In the hallway, leaving only the soft glow from the nursery, a quiet reminder that some things, once protected, did not need to be explained to anyone else. The house settled into silence the way it always did after midnight, not empty, not cold, but still, like it understood the importance of quiet when everything else had already said too much. Danielle stood for a moment in the hallway, her hand resting lightly against the wall, feeling the steady structure beneath her fingertips, something solid, something that did not shift with perception or assumption. The soft glow from the nursery spilled across the floor, a thin line of light that marked the only movement in the house, and she glanced toward it once more before turning away, walking slowly toward the living room. She lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, not fully sitting back, just enough to pause, her posture still upright, her mind not racing, but moving carefully through the events of the night. Not replaying them, not dissecting them, just placing them where they belonged. Her phone rested on the coffee table now, screen dark, silent, but present, a reminder of the other world waiting for her in the morning, one where decisions carried weight not because of who stood in front of her, but because of what was right, what was lawful, what was just. She reached for it again, unlocking the screen, scrolling briefly through the message she had read earlier, and this time she opened the attached file, her eyes scanning the details with the same focus she brought to every case. Names, dates, statements, lines that needed to be read not just for what they said, but for what they revealed. Her expression did not change, but her attention sharpened, the quiet of the house now aligning with the clarity of her work, both spaces requiring the same thing from her: presence, precision, patience. Across the city, Blake sat in the patrol car long after the engine had gone quiet, the dashboard lights dimming gradually, as if even the car understood it was time to let go of the tension it had carried. He had not turned the radio back on. He had not reached for his phone. He simply sat there, his hands resting loosely in his lap now, no longer gripping anything, no longer holding onto the version of control he had relied on without question. The younger officer leaned against the front of the car outside, arms crossed, looking up at the dark sky, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested the night was no longer something to chase, but something to move through. Blake stepped out finally, the door closing softly behind him, and for a moment he just stood there, the quiet surrounding him fully now, uninterrupted by flashing lights or urgent calls. You ever think about how many times it goes the other way? The younger officer asked without looking at him, his voice low, almost reflective. Blake took a breath before answering. More than we realize, he said, the words coming slower, heavier, not as a guess, but as something closer to understanding. The younger officer nodded slightly, his gaze still upward. And nobody stops it, he added. Blake did not respond right away. He looked down at his hands, then back up at the empty lot, then toward the road beyond it, where cars passed without noticing them, without knowing what had shifted in that small space of time. Sometimes, Blake said quietly, it takes someone standing still for you to see how far off you are. The words lingered, not finished, not needing to be. Back in the living room, Danielle closed the file on her phone and set it down again, her eyes lifting toward the window where the faint outline of the street could be seen beyond the glass. Nothing moved out there. No flashing lights. No interruptions. Just stillness. She leaned back this time, allowing her body to settle into the couch fully, her shoulders relaxing, her breathing even, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the contrast between the two worlds she had moved through in the span of an hour. One built on assumption, one built on truth. She did not need to choose between them. She existed in both. And that understanding did not make her smaller. It made her steady. In the parking lot, Blake pushed away from the car and began walking slowly, not toward anything urgent, not toward a call, just moving, his steps measured, his mind no longer filled with instructions, but with questions he had not asked before. The younger officer followed a few steps behind, not speaking, not needing to, the silence between them now shared rather than empty. The night continued, as it always did, stretching forward without pause, but something within it had shifted, something quiet, something that did not demand attention, but changed direction all the same. And inside her home, Danielle remained still, not because she was done, but because she understood that sometimes the most powerful movement was knowing when not to move at all. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, sliding through the curtains in thin lines of pale light that stretched across the living room floor, touching the edge of the couch where Danielle still sat, her posture unchanged from the night before except for the slight shift of her shoulders as she inhaled slowly and opened her eyes. For a moment, she did not move, letting the light settle around her, letting the stillness of the house carry into the start of a new day without interruption. In the nursery, Noah stirred softly, a small sound that broke the silence just enough to signal the world moving forward again, and Danielle rose immediately, her body responding before thought, her steps steady as she moved down the hallway. She pushed the door open gently, the soft creak familiar, and stepped inside, her presence enough to calm the child before he even fully woke. "Good morning," she whispered, lifting him carefully, his small head resting against her shoulder as if it had always belonged there. The routine unfolded without effort, the kind built over time, feeding, changing, holding, each movement precise but gentle, grounded in care that did not need to be questioned. Across the city, the morning looked different but felt just as quiet. Blake stood outside the precinct building, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand, the steam fading into the crisp air as he watched officers move in and out through the glass doors, their steps quick, their voices low, each of them carrying the same routine he had followed for years. But today, the rhythm felt slightly off, not broken, just altered, like a note in a familiar song that no longer matched exactly. The younger officer approached from behind, adjusting his uniform as he stepped beside Blake, his expression thoughtful rather than rushed. "You ever go back and check a stop?" he asked, his voice casual, but carrying intention beneath it. Blake did not look at him right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then lowered the cup, his eyes still fixed on the movement inside the building. "Not like that," he said finally. The younger officer nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "Maybe we should," he added quietly. Blake's grip on the cup tightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of consideration. He did not dismiss the idea. He let it sit, the same way Danielle had let silence sit the night before, allowing it to exist fully before deciding what to do with it. Back inside her home, Danielle moved through the kitchen with Noah on her hip, preparing a simple breakfast, the sound of a pan warming on the stove, the quiet clink of utensils, all blending into a rhythm that felt controlled, intentional. Her phone rested on the counter, screen lighting up with notifications now that the day had begun, emails, reminders, updates, each one pulling her toward the responsibilities waiting beyond these walls. She glanced at it briefly, then turned her attention back to the stove, flipping a piece of toast with a motion so practiced it required no thought. The world could wait a few minutes longer. In the precinct, Blake stepped inside, the hum of activity surrounding him instantly, radios crackling, voices exchanging information, the usual flow of a day beginning, but his movement through it felt slower, more deliberate, as if each step required awareness he had not needed before. He reached his desk and set the coffee down, his hand lingering on the surface for a second before he pulled away. The report screen in front of him glowed faintly, waiting for input, waiting for a version of events that could be written, categorized, filed away. But this time, he did not sit immediately. He stood there, looking at the blank space where words would normally go, and for the first time, he questioned not what to write, but whether writing it the usual way would mean missing what actually mattered. The younger officer paused nearby, watching him, not pushing, not interrupting, just present. Blake finally sat, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, not typing yet, just considering, the memory of the roadside, the calm voice, the steady gaze, all aligning with something that could not be reduced to a simple line in a report. Back at the house, Danielle placed the plate on the table and sat down with Noah, the morning light now fully filling the room. And as she took a small bite, her eyes lifted toward the window, the outside world visible but distant, something she would step into soon enough. She did not rush it. She did not need to, because the day ahead would demand clarity, and she had already found it before it even began. Danielle stepped out of her car in front of the courthouse just as the morning had fully settled into motion, the sun now high enough to cast clean, sharp shadows across the stone steps leading up to the entrance, and the sound of heels, voices, and distant traffic blended into a steady rhythm that felt controlled, intentional, like everything here operated on rules that were meant to be followed, not assumed. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Noah already dropped off safely with someone she trusted, and for a brief second she paused at the base of the steps, not because she needed to, but because she always did, a quiet moment to transition from one role to another, from mother to something else, something equally grounded but carried differently. Inside the building, the air felt cooler, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in clean lines, and people moved with purpose, files in hand, conversations low but focused, each step measured in a way that mirrored the structure of the work itself. Danielle walked through security without hesitation, her presence recognized not loudly, not ceremoniously, but with small nods, brief acknowledgments, the kind that came from familiarity rather than introduction. She reached her office and set her bag down, her movements efficient, her attention already shifting to the work waiting on her desk, a stack of files arranged neatly, each one holding details that required precision, not assumption. Across the city, Blake sat at his desk, the report screen still open in front of him, the cursor blinking in the empty space where a summary should have already been written, and he stared at it longer than necessary, not because he did not know how to fill it, but because he was no longer sure that the usual way of filling it would be enough. The younger officer leaned against the edge of a nearby desk, arms crossed, watching without interrupting, his presence quiet but aware. "You going to log it?" he asked finally, his voice neutral, not pushing, just asking. Blake exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard again before dropping to his lap. "If I write it the way we always do," he said, his tone measured, "it is going to look like everything was fine." The younger officer nodded slightly, his gaze steady. "And it was not," he replied. Blake looked at him then, really looked, the same way he had finally looked at Danielle the night before, and something about the clarity in that statement left no room for avoidance. He turned back to the screen, his fingers moving this time, slower than usual, deliberate, each word placed with care, not just documenting what happened, but acknowledging what had been overlooked. Back in her office, Danielle opened the first file, her eyes scanning the page with practiced precision, her focus absolute, the world outside the text fading as she moved through the details, identifying what mattered, what needed to be questioned, what required action. A knock sounded softly at her door, and she looked up. "Come in," she said, her voice calm, steady. A colleague stepped inside, holding a folder, his expression composed but curious. "Morning," he said. "There is something you might want to see." Danielle gestured for him to place it on her desk, and as she opened it, her eyes moved quickly across the contents, the lines connecting in her mind almost immediately, patterns forming where others might have missed them. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her tone still even, but sharper now, more focused. "Internal review," he replied. "Late submission." Danielle nodded once, already understanding more than had been said, the pieces aligning in a way that made the next step clear without needing to be explained. Across the precinct, Blake finished typing and leaned back slightly, his eyes scanning the report, not for errors, but for honesty, and when he reached the end, he paused, his hand hovering over the submission key. The younger officer stepped closer, glancing at the screen briefly, then back at Blake. That is not how we usually write it, he said quietly. Blake nodded once. No, he replied. It is not. He pressed the key. The report submitted with a soft click, the sound small, but final, and for a moment he sat there, his hands resting on the desk, his posture no longer tense, just still. Back in the courthouse, Danielle closed the file in front of her and looked up, her eyes focused, her expression composed. But there was something deeper there now, something that had been reinforced not by what she did in this room, but by what she carried into it. We are going to take a closer look at this, she said, her voice steady, decisive, and the colleague nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. The day moved forward, as it always did, but in two different places, something had shifted beneath the surface, something quiet, something deliberate, and neither of them needed to say it out loud for it to matter. The courtroom carried a different kind of silence than the house, not soft and warm, but structured, intentional, every sound measured against the weight of what was being decided within its walls, and Danielle stood at the front of it with the same calm she had carried the night before, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table as she looked across the room. The case in front of her was not dramatic on the surface, not loud or obvious, but it held something familiar, something that echoed in the quiet spaces between statements, in the details that had been written down without being fully seen. She turned a page slowly, her eyes scanning the report again, not because she had missed anything, but because she understood that truth often revealed itself in repetition, in the way details aligned when given enough attention. Officer Blake, she said, her voice steady, clear, carrying just enough to reach the back of the room without forcing it. And across from her, Blake shifted slightly in his seat, his uniform pressed, his posture controlled, but his expression different than it had been the day before, more aware, more present. Yes, ma'am, he replied, his voice even, respectful, without hesitation. Danielle nodded once, acknowledging him, then lifted the report slightly. You filed this morning, she continued, her tone neutral, not accusatory, not warm, simply precise. Blake nodded. Yes, ma'am. The room remained still, the judge watching quietly, the few others present focused not on the outcome yet, but on the exchange itself, the way it unfolded without urgency, without raised voices, only clarity. Danielle set the report down gently. You wrote that the stop was initiated based on a call reporting erratic driving, she said, her eyes meeting his, not challenging, but steady. Yes, ma'am, Blake answered again. And you also noted that upon observation, the vehicle did not display erratic behavior, she added. Blake's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice did not change. That is correct. Danielle paused, allowing the words to settle, the silence stretching just long enough to give them weight. So you had a report that did not match what you saw, she said, her tone still even, still controlled. Blake held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Yes, ma'am. The courtroom remained quiet, but something had shifted, not in volume, but in focus, the attention narrowing to the space between what was assumed and what was confirmed. Danielle took a small breath, then continued. And despite that, you proceeded with the stop, the questioning, and the search of the vehicle, she said, not as a question, but as a statement grounded in the report itself. Blake did not look away this time. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice steady. But there was something behind it now, something closer to acknowledgement than defense. Danielle nodded once more, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper, more focused. Why? She asked simply. The word hung in the air, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. Blake did not answer immediately. He looked down briefly, then back up, his shoulders straightening slightly, as if aligning himself with something internal rather than external. Because I trusted the call, he said, his voice measured. Danielle did not interrupt. She let the answer sit, then tilted her head slightly. And when what you saw did not match the call, she asked. Blake inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, deliberate. I should have reassessed, he said, the words clear, unforced. Danielle watched him for a moment, not judging, not pushing, just allowing the statement to exist fully in the space. Then she nodded, once, acknowledging it. Yes, she said quietly. The word carried more weight than it needed to, because it was not about agreement, it was about recognition. The judge shifted slightly, observing, but not intervening, the exchange unfolding exactly as it needed to. Danielle turned slightly, pacing one step before returning to her position, her movements controlled, intentional. "The law does not operate on assumption," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach everyone present. "It operates on observation, on evidence, on alignment between what is reported and what is real." She paused, her eyes moving briefly across the room before settling back on Blake. "And when those do not align," she continued, "the responsibility is not to proceed anyway, but to pause." The word lingered, quiet but firm. Blake nodded slowly, his expression no longer guarded, but open in a way that did not diminish him, but clarified him. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, but this time the words carried understanding, not just compliance. Danielle did not press further. She did not raise her voice. She did not escalate. She simply closed the file in front of her, the sound soft but final, and looked at him one last time. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, her tone even, and then she turned, signaling that the moment had reached its conclusion without needing anything more. The courtroom remained quiet, but the silence felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved in a way that did not require announcement. And as Blake sat there, his hands resting still, his posture unchanged, but his perspective shifted, he understood something that had not been written in any report, something that could not be reduced to a line of text, something that only existed in the space between action and reflection, and once seen, could not be ignored again. The courtroom emptied slowly, not in a rush, not with noise, but in quiet steps that echoed softly against polished floors, each person carrying their own version of what had just unfolded, and Danielle remained where she stood for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly against the table, her eyes following nothing in particular, just allowing the space to settle. The file in front of her was closed now, its contents no longer active, but not forgotten, and she placed her hand on top of it briefly, as if acknowledging the weight it had carried before lifting it and turning away. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light had shifted, softer now, stretching across the courthouse steps in long lines that blurred the boundary between shadow and brightness. And as Danielle stepped into the hallway, the familiar rhythm of movement returned around her, voices low, footsteps steady, the world continuing without pause. She moved through it without needing to assert herself, her presence recognized in small ways, a nod, a glance, a quiet step aside, not because of who she was in title, but because of what she carried in stillness. Across the room, Blake remained seated for a moment after everyone else had begun to leave, his hands resting on his knees, his posture unchanged, but something inside him had shifted in a way that did not need to be spoken. The younger officer waited near the door, not rushing him, just standing there, giving space without needing to explain why. Blake finally stood, his movements slower than usual, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, and as he walked toward the exit, his eyes lifted briefly, catching Danielle's reflection in the glass of the hallway window ahead. She did not stop. She did not turn. But the reflection held for just a second, enough for recognition, not of status, not of roles, but of something quieter, something human. Outside, the air felt different than it had the night before, clearer, warmer, the kind of shift that came not from weather, but from perspective. Danielle descended the steps with measured ease, her heels striking the stone in a steady rhythm, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and at the bottom, she paused for just a moment, her gaze lifting toward the street beyond, where cars moved in steady lines, where life continued without interruption. She reached into her bag, retrieving her phone, and checked the time, then slipped it back without opening any messages, her priorities already aligned without needing confirmation. A car pulled up at the curb, familiar, expected, and she stepped toward it, opening the door with a smooth motion before settling inside, the world outside dimming slightly as the door closed. Inside the courthouse, Blake stepped out into the light, the brightness catching him off guard for just a second, and he blinked, adjusting, his eyes scanning the steps, the street, the movement of people passing by without noticing him, without knowing the weight of what had just shifted. The younger officer stepped beside him, hands at his sides, his expression thoughtful but lighter now, as if something unresolved had found its place. "You did not argue," he said quietly. Blake shook his head once. "There was nothing to argue," he replied, his voice even, not defensive, not resigned, just clear. The younger officer nodded slowly, then looked out toward the street. "Most people would have," he added. Blake followed his gaze, watching as Danielle's car merged into traffic, becoming just another part of the city's flow. "Most people would not have listened," Blake said after a moment, his tone softer now, more reflective. The words lingered between them, not needing to be expanded, not needing to be explained. Danielle adjusted the rearview mirror slightly as she drove, her reflection steady, her eyes focused on the road ahead, the lines clear, the direction certain, and for a moment, the image of the flashing lights from the night before crossed her mind, not as something sharp or intrusive, but as something distant, something that had already been placed where it belonged. She did not carry it with tension. She carried it with understanding. The city moved around her, buildings rising and falling in her peripheral vision, the rhythm of traffic steady, predictable, and she merged seamlessly into it, her movement smooth, controlled, uninterrupted. Back on the courthouse steps, Blake took a slow breath, the air filling his lungs in a way that felt different than it had before, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, and he looked down at his hands for a brief second before lifting his gaze again. There was no announcement, no resolution spoken out loud. Just a quiet shift in the way he stood, in the way he saw, in the way he would move forward from this point on. Danielle did not change the world that day. She did not need to. As her car disappeared into the steady flow of traffic, as the courthouse doors closed behind her, as the echoes of the courtroom faded into routine, something else remained, something smaller, quieter, but just as real. She changed one moment, one decision, one way of seeing, and that was enough.